Hey kids. This is chapter 4 of The Fate of the Russian Revolution, volume 2, edited by Sean Matt Gomna. When I read the last book, I kind of read all the pieces, kind of like their own pieces, because that was kind of how they're like set up. But this book appears, at least from my reading of it thus far, about 100 pages in. It seems to be way more like curated, so it's like kind of like trying to like reconstruct the debates with like primary source documents, right? So it seems like it makes less sense to kind of like release all the pieces as like standalone pieces, because there's kind of like I don't know, like the organization of this of this particular book seems way more like integrated, if that makes sense. Not that the other was like a scattered mess or by any means, it was very well organized, but this one's way more like, okay, this piece goes here, and then this piece goes here, and there's a reason why they go here. So I'm reading these as like chapters, which is cool and not cool, insofar as the cohesion will be there, but these videos will be rather long. But that's okay. We can live. I might not do that. I'm probably not going to do the whole like chapters for the first couple pieces, but I might. I'm not sure. I have all these recordings made. I haven't done anything with the videos yet, so I'll see what happens. So, but this is all going to be one piece. So, thanks for listening. Let's get started. The introduction to this chapter says, the idea and the fact of Stalinist-made anti-capitalist revolutions would dominate and shape the orthodox Trotskyists for decades after 1940. The idea first appeared when Stalin took eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and eastern Romania, and tried to take Finland, assimilating their economic and social structures to that of the USSR, when Max Shachtman and his comrades accused Trotsky of giving credence to the idea of Stalinist, quote, bureaucratic-proletarian revolution, end quote, in Poland and Finland. Trotsky denied it indignantly. After Trotsky's death, the Orthodox Trotskyists revived the idea in relation to the states of the new Russian Empire and the independent Stalinist states such as Yugoslavia and China. See also Chapter 6 of this volume. Alright, so the first piece is by Trotsky, and it's titled Revolutionary in Character, Military Bureaucratic in Form. This is an excerpt from the USSR in War, which is on this channel already. So let's get this party started. So this is titled, at least in the book, it's given the title, Revolutionary in Character, Military Bureaucratic in Form. It's from 1939. As I am writing these lines, the question of the territories occupied by the Red Army bracket in eastern Poland end bracket still remains obscure. The cabled dispatches contradict each other since both sides lie a great deal, but the actual relationships on the scene are no doubt still extremely unsettled. Most of the occupied territories will doubtlessly become part of the USSR. In what form? Let us for a moment conceive that in accordance with the treaty with Hitler, the Moscow government leaves untouched the rights of private property in the occupied areas and limits itself to, quote, control, end quote, after the fascist pattern. Such a concession would have a deep-going principled character and might become a starting point for a new chapter in the history of the Soviet regime, and consequently a starting point for a new appraisal on our part of the nature of the Soviet state. It is more likely, however, that in the territories scheduled to become part of the USSR, the Moscow government will carry through the expropriation of the large landowners and statification of the means of production. This variant is most probable not because the bureaucracy remains true to the socialist program, but because it is neither desirous nor capable of sharing the power and the privileges the latter entails with the old ruling classes in the occupied territories. Here an analogy literally offers itself. The first Bonaparte halted the revolution by means of a military dictatorship. However, when the French troops invaded Poland, Napoleon signed a decree, quote, "Serfdom is abolished," end quote. The measure was dictated not by Napoleon's sympathies for the peasants, nor by democratic principles, but rather by the fact that the Bonapartist dictatorship based itself not on feudal, but on bourgeois property relations. Inasmuch as Stalin's Bonapartist dictatorship bases itself not on private but on state property, the invasion of Poland by the Red Army should, in the nature of the case, result in the abolition of private capitalist property, so as thus to bring the regime of the occupied territories into accord with the regime of the USSR. This measure, revolutionary in character, the, quote, "expropriation of the expropriators," end quote, is in this case achieved in a military bureaucratic fashion. The appeal to independent activity on the part of the masses in the new territories, and without such an appeal, even if worded with extreme caution, it is impossible to constitute a new regime, will on the morrow undoubtedly be suppressed by ruthless police measures in order to assure the preponderance of the bureaucracy over the awakened revolutionary masses. This is one side of the matter, but there is another. In order to gain the possibility of occupying Poland through a military alliance with Hitler, the Kremlin for a long time deceived and continues to deceive the masses in the USSR and in the whole world, and has thereby brought about the complete disorganization of the ranks of its own communist international. The primary political criterion for us is not the transformation of property relations in this or another area, however important these may be in themselves, but rather the change in the consciousness and organization of the world proletariat, the raising of their capacity for defending former conquest and accomplishing new conquests. From this one, and the only decisive standpoint, the politics of Moscow, taken as a whole, wholly retain the reactionary character and remain the chief obstacle on the road to world revolution. Our general appraisal of the Kremlin in Comintern does not, however, alter the particular fact that the statification of property in the occupied territories is in itself a progressive measure. We must recognize this openly. Were Hitler on the morrow to throw his armies against the East, to restore, quote, "law and order," end quote, in eastern Poland, the advanced workers would defend against Hitler these new property forms established by the Bonapartist Soviet bureaucracy. The statification of the means of production is, as we said, a progressive measure. But the statification of the means of production's progressiveness is relative. The statification of the means of production's specific weight depends on the sum total of all the other factors. Thus we must first and foremost establish that the extension of the territory dominated by bureaucratic autocracy and parasitism, cloaked by, quote, "socialist measures," can augment the prestige of the Kremlin, engender illusions concerning the possibility of replacing the proletarian revolution by bureaucratic maneuvers, and so on. This evil by far outweighs the progressive content of Stalinist reforms in Poland. In order that nationalized property in the occupied areas, as well as in the USSR, become a basis for genuinely progressive, that is to say socialist development, it is necessary to overthrow the Moscow bureaucracy. Our program retains consequently all our program's validity. The events did not catch us unaware. It is necessary only to interpret events correctly. It is necessary to understand clearly that sharp contradictions are contained in the character of the USSR and in the USSR's international position. It is impossible to free oneself from those contradictions with the help of terminological sleight of hand, quote, "worker state," quote, "not worker state." We must take the facts as the facts are. We must build our policy by taking as our starting point the real relations and contradictions. We do not entrust the Kremlin with any historic mission. We were and remain against seizures of new territories by the Kremlin. We are for the independence of Soviet Ukraine, and if the Belarusians themselves wish, of Soviet Belorussia. At the same time, in the sections of Poland occupied by the Red Army, partisans of the Fourth International must play the most decisive part in expropriating the landlords and capitalists, in dividing the land among the peasants and creating Soviets and workers' committees, etc. While doing so, they must preserve their political independence. They must fight during elections to the Soviets and factory committees for the complete independence of the latter from the bureaucracy, and they must conduct revolutionary propaganda in the spirit of distrust towards the Kremlin and the Kremlin's local agencies. But let us suppose that Hitler turns his weapons against the East and invades territories occupied by the Red Army. Under these conditions, partisans of the Fourth International, without changing in any way their attitude toward the Kremlin oligarchy, will advance to the forefront as the most urgent task of the hour, the military resistance against Hitler. The workers will say, quote, "We cannot cede to Hitler the overthrowing of Stalin. That is our own task," end quote. During the military struggle against Hitler, the revolutionary workers will strive to enter into the closest possible comradely relations with the rank-and-file fighters of the Red Army. While arms in hand they deal blows to Hitler, the Bolshevik-Leninists will at the same time conduct revolutionary propaganda against Stalin, preparing Stalin's overthrow at the next and perhaps very near stage. So a piece titled, again, that was from the USSR in War, 25th of September 1939. Next piece, A Civil War and the Red Army is on the Side of the Workers, by Leon Trotsky. This is from 1939. And this was from A Petty Bourgeois Opposition in the Socialist Workers' Party, which is also on this channel. That's from In Defense of Marxism. Burnham and Shachtman in January 1939 stood in favor of unconditional defense of the Soviet Union and defined the significance of unconditional defense entirely correctly as, quote, "regardless and in spite of the Stalinist regime," end quote. And yet this article was written when the experience of the Spanish Revolution had already been drained to completion. Comrade Cannon is absolutely right when Comrade Cannon says that the role of Stalinism in Spain was incomparably more criminal than in Poland or Finland. In the first case, the bureaucracy, through hangman's methods, strangled a socialist revolution. In the second case, it gives an impulse to the socialist revolution through bureaucratic methods. Why did Burnham and Shachtman themselves so unexpectedly shift to the position of the, quote, League of Abandoned Hopes, end quote? ... In order to punish the Stalinists for their unquestionable crimes, the bracket minority and bracket resolution, following the petty bourgeois Democrats of all shadings, does not mention by so much as a word that the Red Army in Finland expropriates large landowners and introduces workers' control while preparing for the expropriation of the capitalists. Tomorrow the Stalinists will strangle the Finnish workers, but now they are compelled to give a tremendous impulse to the class struggle in its sharpest form. The leaders of the opposition construct their policy not upon the, quote, concrete, end quote, process that is taking place in Finland, but upon democratic abstractions and noble sentiments. The Soviet-Finnish war is apparently beginning to be supplemented by a war in which the Red Army finds itself at the given stage in the same camp as the Finnish petty peasants and the workers. While the Finnish army enjoys the support of the owning classes, the conservative labor bureaucracy, and the Anglo-Saxon imperialists, the hopes which the Red Army awakens among the Finnish poor will, unless international revolution intervenes, prove to be an illusion. The collaboration of the Red Army with the poor will be only temporary. The Kremlin will soon turn its weapons against the Finnish workers and peasants. We know all this now, and we say it openly as a warning. But in this, quote, concrete, end quote, civil war that is taking place on Finnish territory, that, quote, concrete, end quote, position must the, quote, concrete, end quote, partisans of the Fourth International take. If they fought in Spain in the Republican camp in spite of the fact that the Stalinists were strangling the socialist revolution, all the more that must they participate in Finland, in that camp where the Stalinists are compelled to support the expropriation of the capitalists, ... As for the Kremlin, it is at present time forced, and this is not a hypothetical but a real situation, to provoke a social revolutionary movement in Finland in order to attempt to strangle it politically tomorrow, to cover a given social revolutionary movement with the all-embracing term of imperialism only because it is provoked, mutilated, and at the same time strangled by the Kremlin, merely testifies to one's theoretical and political poverty. ... Again, that's from A Petty Bourgeois Opposition to the Socialist Workers in the Socialist Workers' Party by Trotsky, 15th of December, 1939, on this channel, which is on this channel in whole. The next piece is titled, Bureaucratic-Proletarian Revolution is Not Desirable and Not Possible. This is by Max Shachtman. It's from 1940. This is from a piece titled Max Shachtman's Open Letter to Trotsky from the 1st of January 1940. It was published in New International, March 1940. I believe this video is this piece in its entirety is on the channel. If you want to hear it more. So let's start. I cannot leave unmentioned your (Trotsky's) and references to the quote revolutionary end quote role of Stalinism in Stalinism's recent invasions. Quote, in the first case, Spain, the bureaucracy through hangman's methods strangled a socialist revolution. In the second case, Poland, it gave an impulse to the socialist revolution through bureaucratic methods. End quote. Here again I find myself compelled to disagree with you. The bureaucratic bourgeois revolution, that I know of. I know of Napoleon's, quote, revolution from above, end quote, in Poland over 100 years ago. I know of Alexander's emancipation of the serfs, quote, from above, end quote, out of the fear of peasant uprisings. I know of Bismarck's, quote, revolution from above, end quote. I know that Hitler and Mussolini play with the idea of a, quote, I know that Hitler and Mussolini play with the idea of an Arab, quote, national revolution, end quote, in Palestine out of purely imperialist and military reasons directed against their rival, England. But the bureaucratic-proletarian revolution, that I do not know of, and I do not believe in it. I do not believe that the bureaucratic-proletarian revolution took place in Poland even for a day, or that the bureaucratic-proletarian revolution is taking place or is about to take place in Finland. If Stalin, quote, established state property in the conquered territories in Poland, it was not at all because, as you imply elsewhere, Stalin was, quote, compelled, end quote, to do so on account of the irresistible force of state property in the Soviet Union. Stalin was perfectly willing to, quote, share the power, end quote, with the Polish bourgeoisie, as Stalin is doing with the bourgeoisie of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and on this basis, preserve intact your private property, and you will turn over to me your political power, which I will assure with my army. This is what the Kremlin proposed during the negotiations with Anglo-French imperialism. The Polish bourgeoisie and landlords refused this, quote, generous, end quote, offer for a division of power. The 3 Baltic countries had the offer imposed on them by force. When the regime of the Polish colonels collapsed under the blows of the German army, the bourgeoisie fled in every direction. In the Polish Ukraine and White Russia, where class exploitation was intensified by national oppression, the bourgeoisie of those territories was predominantly Polish. The peasants began to take over the land themselves, to drive off the landlords which were already half in flight. Even the garbled and censored reports of those days permit us to see that the workers were beginning to act similarly. In Vilna, a spontaneously formed, quote, Soviet was reported. The Red Army entered Poland, encountered no resistance from the Polish bourgeoisie and the Polish bourgeoisie's army, because there wasn't any to speak of. The Red Army came in as a counter-revolutionary force. Far from, quote, giving an impulse to the socialist revolution, end quote, it strangled it. The Vilna, quote, Soviet, end quote, was of course violently suppressed. Just what has since then been, quote, nationalized, how it has been, quote, nationalized, I do not know, and no one has yet been able to say exactly. In any case, I repeat with you that the nationalization, real or alleged, cannot be the decisive criterion for us. The Stalinist bureaucracy is capable only of strangling revolutions, not making revolutions or giving an impulse to revolutions. To prove the contrary, some evidence must be produced, and I find none in your article. I find even less for you, how shall I put it, astonishing remarks about Finland. You say that we do not, quote, mention by so much as a word that the Red Army in Finland expropriates large landowners and introduces workers' control while preparing for the expropriation of the capitalists, end quote. True, not by so much as a word. Why? Because the first anyone has heard in our party, anyone, of the expropriation of the large landowners and the introduction of workers' control in Finland by the Red Army is in your article. Where is this taking place? On what reports do you base yourself? There is no trace of workers' control in the Soviet Union itself. There's even less than that in Finland. That, at least so far as my knowledge goes, and on this point I have questioned unavailingly many Canaanites. You continue, quote, tomorrow the Stalinists will strangle the Finnish workers But now they are compelled to give, parenthesis, why? Why in Finland and not in Spain or Estonia, end parenthesis, a tremendous impulse to the class struggle in its sharpest form. The leaders of the opposition construct their policy not upon the, quote, concrete, end quote, process that is taking place in Finland, but upon democratic abstractions and noble sentiments, end quote. Trotsky. Where is this, quote, tremendous impulse to the class struggle, end quote, in Finland, end quote, in its sharpest form, end quote, to boot? We base our policy on, quote, abstractions, end quote. Let us grant that. On what do you base your statement about the tremendous impulse to the class struggle? No one, I repeat, in our party has seen the slightest sign of it yet. Perhaps you have seen credible reports about it, in which case such important news should appear in our press. Again you write, quote, the Soviet-Finnish war is evidently, parenthesis, question mark, exclamation point, end parenthesis, are beginning to be completed with a civil war in which the Red Army finds itself at the given stage in the same camp as the Finnish petty peasants and workers, end quote. Sumi. Yeah. End quote. You write a little bit further that the Stalinist policy is, quote, the policy of exterminating finance capital, end quote. And finally you write, quote, as for the Kremlin, it is at the present time forced, and this is not a hypothetical but a real situation, to provoke a social revolutionary movement in Finland, in order to attempt to strangle it politically tomorrow, end quote. Where is the civil war in Finland, which is, quote, evidently already beginning, end quote? Unless you refer to the government of the idiotic scoundrel Kuusinen, we have not yet seen the first traces of that civil war, regardless of how much we should like to see it, no matter how anxious we are to develop a policy that will promote it, no matter how firmly we count upon its eventual materialization. Do you deduce this, quote, civil war, end quote, from an abstract and false theoretical estimation of the role of the Kremlin bureaucracy? Or is there some objective evidence that this, quote, concrete, end quote, process is taking place in Finland? Where is the, quote, social revolutionary movement in Finland, end quote, that the Kremlin is, quote, forced to provoke, end quote? It is perhaps the program of the Kuusinen, quote, democratic peoples, end quote, government that is provoking it. That program is formally the program of a bourgeois, quote, democracy, end quote. Since the beginning of the war, one of the reasons why we condemned the Finnish invasion as reactionary was precisely the fact that by it, Stalin was driving the Finnish workers and peasants into a bourgeois patriotic frenzy, into the arms of the Mannerheims, into the, quote, sacred union, and, quote, national unity, end quote. What evidence is there that this has changed? We repeat, we know of none, not a scintilla. It is possible and even likely that, as the Finnish bourgeois regime begins to crumble, the workers and peasants will separate from it and take the first steps on the road to independent class action, but there is every reason to believe that they will not take the road to the Stalinist camp. That they will not, as Cannon tells the Russian workers to do, give, quote, material and military support, end quote, to the annexationist invaders. If they did, their tragedy would be no less than that which they are suffering today as the pawns of bourgeois patriotism. You speak of the Stalinists representing the, quote, policy of exterminating finance capital, end quote. I find it difficult to believe that you really mean this literally. No, the role the Stalinists have played, above all outside the borders of the Soviet Union, has been that of conservative prop of the rule of finance capital. The Kremlin's agency of finance capital has not become overnight the latter's exterminator. It does not play a revolutionary role, any more than the Chinese national bourgeoisie played a revolutionary role, any more than Guchkov. Guchkov appears to refer to a guy who lived from 1862 to 1936. Guchkov was a Russian politician, chairman of the Third Duma, and minister of war in the Russian provisional government. it actually has a description of them right here. It does not play a revolutionary role any more than the Chinese national bourgeoisie played a revolutionary role, any more than Guchkov, bracket, conservative politician, war minister in the first provisional government, end bracket, played a revolutionary role in March 1917 in Russia, bracket, the first revolution which overthrew the Tsar and threw up a bourgeois provisional government, end bracket. The role of the Stalinist bureaucracy is counter-revolutionary. Would I tell the Finnish workers to accept arms and ammunition from Stalin? Would I tell the Hindu workers and peasants to accept arms and ammunition from Hitler? That is how you pose the question. My answer is, of course I would. I would take arms for the revolution from Hitler, or Mussolini, or Stalin, or Daladier, or a Caucasian mountain bandit. If I get them free of charge, so much the better. But it would not follow for me that just because I welcome arms smuggled to me in Palestine by Hitler, that I would welcome Hitler if he sent his army to Palestine, or that I would urge anybody to give that army, quote, material and moral support, end quote. The, quote, character, end quote, of Hitler's intervention in Palestine would have changed. By the same token, when Stalin is conducting a reactionary, annexationist war in Finland, I would really accept arms from him if I were a revolutionist in Finland, although in that case 9 chances out of 10 I would receive his, quote, armed aid, end quote, in the form of a bullet in the heart or a bayonet in the throat, and under certain conditions given a favorable relation of forces between his army and the Finnish revolutionary movement, I would even seek a practical military working agreement with him. But it does not follow from this that I call upon anyone now to give him, quote, material and military support, end quote, in his reactionary war. I repeat, I do not believe in the bureaucratic-proletarian socialist revolution. I do not mean by this merely that I have, quote, no faith in it, end quote. No one in our movement has. I mean that I do not consider it possible. I reject the conception not out of, quote, sentimental reasons or a Tolstoyan, quote, faith in the people, but because I believe it to be scientifically correct to repeat with Marx that the emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class itself. The bourgeois revolution, for a series of historical and social reasons, could be made and was made by other classes and social strata. The bourgeoisie could be liberated from feudal rule and establish the bourgeoisie's social dictatorship under the aegis of other social groups. But the proletarian revolution cannot be made by others than the proletariat acting as a mass. Therein, among other things, it is distinguished from all preceding revolutions. No one else can free it, not even for a day. One second. Okay, so that's the end of the piece. That piece, which again is from Max Shachtman's Open Letter to Trotsky from the 1st of January 1940, published in New International, March 1940. The next piece is titled, Civil War is a Fact. This is by Leon Trotsky, and this is an extract from A Scratch to the Danger of Gangrene, which again is on this channel. My remark that the Kremlin, with its bureaucratic methods, gave an impulse to the socialist revolution in Poland is converted by Shachtman into assertion that, in my opinion, a, quote, bureaucratic revolution, end quote, of the proletariat is presumably possible. This is not only incorrect, but disloyal. My expression was rigidly limited. It's not the question of, quote, bureaucratic revolution, end quote, but only a bureaucratic impulse. To deny this impulse is to deny reality. The popular masses in Western Ukraine and Belarusia is, in any event, felt this impulse, understood its meaning, and used it to accomplish a drastic overturn in property relations. A revolutionary party which failed to notice this impulse in time and refused to utilize it would be fit for nothing but the ash can. This impulse in the direction of socialist revolution was possible only because the bureaucracy of the USSR straddles and has its roots in the economy of a workers' state. The revolutionary utilization of this, quote, impulse by the Ukrainian Belarusians was possible only through the class struggle in the occupied territories and through the power of the example of the October Revolution. Finally, the swift strangulation of semi-strangulation of this revolutionary mass movement was made possible through the isolation of this movement and the might of the Moscow bureaucracy. Whoever failed to understand the dialectic interaction of these three factors, the worker state, the oppressed masses, and the Bonapartist bureaucracy, had best restrained themselves from idle talk about events in Poland. At the elections for the National Assembly of Western Ukraine and Western Belarusia, the electoral program, dictated of course by the Kremlin, included three extremely important points: inclusion of both provinces in the Federation of the USSR, confiscation of landlords' estates in favor of the peasants, the nationalization of large industry and the banks. The Ukrainian Democrats, judging from their conduct, deem it a lesser evil to be unified under the rule of a single state, and from the standpoint of the future struggle for independence they are correct. As for the other 2 points in the program, one should think that there could be no doubt in our midst as to their progressiveness. Seeking to get around reality, namely that nothing else but the social foundations of the USSR forced a social revolutionary program upon the Kremlin, Shachtman refers to Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, where everything has remained as of old, an incredible argument. No one has said that the Soviet bureaucracy always and everywhere either wishes or is able to accomplish the expropriation of the bourgeoisie. We only say that no other government could have accomplished that social overturn which the Kremlin bureaucracy, notwithstanding its alliance with Hitler, found itself compelled to sanction in eastern Poland. Failing this, it could not include the territory in the Federation of the USSR. Shachtman is aware of the overturn itself. Shachtman cannot deny it. He is incapable of explaining it, but he nevertheless attempts to save face. He writes, quote, "In the Polish Ukraine and White Russia, where class exploitation was intensified by national oppression, ... the peasants began to take over the land themselves, to drive off the landlords who were already half in flight," end quote, etc. The Red Army, in turn, it turns out, had no connection whatever with all this. It came into Poland only as a, quote, counter-revolutionary force, end quote, in order to suppress the movement. But why didn't the workers and peasants in Western Poland, seized by Hitler, arrange a revolution? Why was it chiefly revolutionists, quote, Democrats and Jews who fled from there, while in Eastern Poland it was chiefly the landlords, capitalists who fled? Shachtman lacks the time to think this out. Shachtman is in a hurry to explain to me that the conception of, quote, bureaucratic revolution, end quote, is absurd, for the emancipation of the workers can be carried out only by the workers themselves. Am I not justified in repeating that Shachtman obviously feels he is standing in a nursery? In the Parisian organ of the Mensheviks, who, if that is possible, are even more, quote, irreconcilable, end quote, in their attitude toward the Kremlin's foreign policy than Shachtman, it is reported that, quote, in the villages, very frequently, at the very approach of the Soviet troops, parenthesis, i.e. even prior to their entering a given district, Leon Trotsky, end parenthesis, peasant committees sprang up everywhere, the elementary organs of a revolutionary peasant self-rule, ... end quote. The military authorities hastened, of course, to subordinate these committees to the bureaucratic organs established by them in the urban centers. Nevertheless, they were compelled to rest upon the peasant committees, since without them it was impossible to carry out the agrarian revolution. The leader of the Mensheviks, Dan, wrote on October 19th, quote, "According to the unanimous testimony of all observers, the appearance of the Soviet army and the Soviet bureaucracy provides not only in the territory occupied by them, but beyond its confines, an impulse to social turmoil and social transformations," end quote. The, quote, impulse, end quote, it will be observed, was invented not by me, but by the, quote, unanimous testimony of all observers, end quote, who possessed eyes and ears. Dan goes even further and expresses the supposition that, quote, The waves engendered by this impulse will not only hit Germany powerfully in a comparatively short period of time, but also, to one degree or another, roll on to other states." End quote. Another Menshevik writes, quote, "However they may have attempted in the Kremlin to avoid anything which might smack of the Great Revolution, the very fact of the entry of Soviet troops into the territories of eastern Poland, with its long outlived semi-feudal agrarian relations, had to provoke a stormy agrarian movement. With the approach of Soviet troops, the peasants began to seize landlords' estates and to form peasant committees." End quote. You will observe, with the approach of Soviet troops, and not at all with their withdrawal, as should follow in accordance with Shachtman's words. I cite the testimony of the Mensheviks because the Mensheviks are very well informed, the Menshevik sources of information coming through Polish and Jewish immigrants friendly to them who have gathered in France, and also because, having capitulated to the French bourgeoisie, these gentlemen cannot possibly be suspected of capitulation to Stalinism. The testimony of the Mensheviks, furthermore, is confirmed by the reports of the bourgeois press. One second. Quote, "The agrarian revolution in Soviet Poland has had the force of a spontaneous movement. As soon as the report spread that the Red Army had crossed the river Zbruch, ZBRUCZ, the peasants began to share out among themselves the landlords' acres. Land was given first to smallholders, and in this way about 30% of agricultural land was expropriated." End quote. New York Times, January 17, 1940. Under the guise of a new argument, Shachtman hands me my own words to the effect that the expropriation of property owners in eastern Poland cannot alter our appraisal of the general policies of the Kremlin. Of course it cannot. No one has proposed this. With the aid of the Comintern, the Kremlin has disoriented and demoralized the working class, so that it has not only facilitated the outbreak of a new imperialist war, but also made extremely difficult the utilization of this war for revolution. Compared with those crimes, the social overturn in the two provinces, which was paid for, moreover, by the enslavement of Poland, is of course of secondary importance and does not alter the general reactionary character of the Kremlin's policy. But upon the initiative of the opposition itself, the question now posed is not one of general policy, but of its concrete refraction under specific conditions of time and place. To the peasants of Galicia and western Belorussia, the agrarian overturn was of highest importance. The Fourth International could not have boycotted this overturn on the ground that the initiative was taken by the reactionary bureaucracy. Our outright duty was to participate in the overturn on the side of the workers and peasants, and to that extent on the side of the Red Army. At the same time, it was indispensable to warn the masses tirelessly of the generally reactionary character of the Kremlin's policy and of those dangers it bears for the occupied territories. To know how to combine these two tasks, or more precisely, two sides of one and the same task, just this is Bolshevik politics. Having revealed such odd perspicacity in understanding the events in Poland, Shachtman descends upon me with redoubled authority in connection with events in Finland. In my article, A Petty Bourgeois Opposition, I wrote that, quote, "The Soviet-Finnish War is apparently beginning to be supplemented by a civil war in which the Red Army finds the Red Army's self at a given stage in the same camp as the Finnish petty peasants and the workers, ... end quote. This extremely cautious formula did not meet with the approval of my unsparing judge. My evaluation of events in Poland had already taken him off balance. Quote, "I find even less proof for your, how shall I put it, astonishing remarks about Finland," end quote, writes Shachtman. I'm very sorry that Shachtman chooses to become astonished rather than think things out. In the Baltic states, the Kremlin confines its task to making strategical gains with the unquestionable calculation that in the future, these strategic military bases will permit the Sovietization of these former sections of the Tsarist Empire too. These successes in the Baltic, achieved by diplomatic threat, met with resistance, however, from Finland. To reconcile itself to this resistance would have meant that the Kremlin placed in jeopardy its, quote, prestige, and thereby its successes in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Thus, contrary to its initial plans for the Kremlin, felt compelled to resort to armed force. From this fact, every thinking person posed to himself the following question: does the Kremlin wish only to frighten the Finnish bourgeoisie and force the Finnish bourgeoisie to make concessions, or must it now grow further? To this question, naturally, there could be no, quote, automatic, end quote, answer. It was necessary, in the light of general tendencies, to orient oneself upon concrete symptoms. The leaders of the opposition are incapable of this. Military operations began on November 30th. That very same day, the Central Committee of the Finnish Communist Party, undoubtedly located in either Leningrad or Moscow, issued a radio manifesto to the toiling people of Finland. This manifesto proclaimed, quote, "For the second time in the history of Finland and the Finnish working class is beginning a struggle against the yoke of the plutocracy. The first experience of the workers and peasants in 1918 terminated in the victory of the capitalists and the landlords, but this time, the toiling people must win," end quote. This manifesto alone clearly indicates that not an attempt to scare the bourgeois government of Finland was involved, but it planned to provoke insurrection in the country and to supplement the invasion of the Red Army with civil war. The declaration of the so-called People's Government, published on the 2nd of December, states, quote, "In different parts of the country, the people have already arisen and proclaimed the creation of a democratic republic," end quote. This assertion is obviously a fabrication. Otherwise, the manifesto would have mentioned the places where the attempts at insurrection took place. It is possible, however, that isolated attempts prepared from without ended in failure, and that precisely because of this it was deemed best not to go into details. In any case, the news concerning, quote, "insurrections," end quote, constituted a call to insurrection. Moreover, the declaration carried information concerning the formation of the, quote, "First Finnish Corps," which in the course of coming battles will be enlarged by volunteers from the ranks of revolutionary workers and peasants, end quote. Whether there were 1,000 men in this, quote, corps, or only 100, the meaning of the, quote, corps in determining the policies of the Kremlin was incontestable. At the same time, the cable dispatches reported the expropriation of large landholders in the border regions. There is not the slightest ground to doubt that this is just what took place during the first advance of the Red Army. But even if these dispatches are considered fabrications, they completely preserve their meaning as a call for an agrarian revolution. Thus, I had every justification to declare that, quote, "the Soviet-Finnish War is apparently beginning to be supplemented by a civil war," end quote. At the beginning of December, true enough, I had at my disposal only a part of these facts, but against the background of the general situation, and I take the liberty to add, with the aid of an understanding of its internal logic, the isolated symptoms enabled me to draw the necessary conclusions concerning the direction of the entire struggle. Without such semi-a priori conclusions, one can be a rationalizing observer, but in no case an active participant in events. But why did the appeal of the, quote, "people's government," end quote, fail to bring immediate mass response? For three reasons. First, Finland is dominated completely by a reactionary military machine which is supported not only by the bourgeoisie, but by the top layers of the peasantry and the labor bureaucracy. Secondly, the policy of the Kremlin succeeded in transforming the Finnish Communist Party into an insignificant factor. Thirdly, the regime of the USSR is in no way capable of arousing enthusiasm among the Finnish toiling masses. Even in the Ukraine from 1918 to 1920, the peasants responded very slowly to appeals to seize the estates of the landlords. Because the local Soviet power was still weak and every success of the whites brought about ruthless, punitive expeditions. All the less reason is there for surprise that the Finnish poor peasants' delay in responding to an appeal for an agrarian revolution. To set the peasants in motion, serious successes of the Red Army are required. But during the first badly prepared advance, the Red Army suffered only failures. Under such conditions, there could not even be talk of the peasant rising. It was impossible to expect an independent civil war in Finland,
at the given stage. My calculations spoke quite precisely of supplementing military operations by measures of civil war. I have in mind, at least until the Finnish army is annihilated, only the occupied territory and the nearby regions. Today, on January 17th, as I write these lines, dispatches from a Finnish source report that one of the border provinces has been invaded by detachments of Finnish émigrés, and that brother is literally killing brother there. What is this if not an episode in a civil war? In any case, there can be no doubt that a new advance of the Red Army into Finland will confirm at every step our general appraisal of the war. Shachtman has neither an analysis of the events nor the hint of a prognosis. He confines himself to noble indignation, and for this reason at every step he sinks deeper into the mire. The appeal of the, quote, people's government, end quote, calls for workers' control. What can this mean, exclaimed Shachtman. There is no workers' control in the USSR. Whence will it come in Finland? Sad to say, Shachtman reveals complete lack of understanding of the situation. In the USSR, workers' control is a stage long ago completed. From control over the bourgeoisie, they passed to management of nationalized production. From the management of workers to the command of the bureaucracy. New workers' control would now signify control over the bureaucracy. This cannot be established except as the result of a successful uprising against the bureaucracy. In Finland, workers' control still signifies nothing more than crowding out the native bourgeoisie, whose place the bureaucracy proposes to take. Furthermore, one should not think that the Kremlin is so stupid as to attempt ruling Eastern Poland or Finland by means of imported commissars. Of greatest urgency to the Kremlin is the extraction of a new administrative apparatus among the toiling population of the occupied areas. This task can be solved only in several stages. The first stage is the peasant committees and the committees of workers' control. Shachtman clutches eagerly even at the fact that Kusinen's program, quote, is formally the program of a bourgeois, quote, democracy, end quote, end quote. Does Shachtman mean to say that by this that the Kremlin is more interested in establishing bourgeois democracy in Finland than in drawing Finland into the framework of the USSR? Shachtman himself doesn't know what he wants to say. In Spain, which Moscow did not prepare for union with the USSR, it was actually a question of demonstrating the ability of the Kremlin to safeguard bourgeois democracy against proletarian revolution. This task flowed from the interests of the Kremlin bureaucracy in that particular international situation. Today, the situation is a different situation. The Kremlin is not preparing to demonstrate the Kremlin's usefulness to France, England, and the United States. As its actions have proved, the Kremlin has firmly decided to Sovietize Finland, at once or in two stages. The program of the Kuusinen government, even if approaching from a, quote, formal, end quote, point of view, does not differ from the program of the Bolsheviks in November 1917. The program of the Kuusinen government, even if approached from a, quote, formal, end quote, point of view, does not differ from the program of the Bolsheviks in November 1917. True enough, Shachtman makes much of the fact that I generally place significance on the manifesto of the, quote, idiot, end quote, Kuusinen. However, I shall take the liberty of considering that the, quote, idiot, Kuusinen, acting on the ukaz, which is a decree, of the Kremlin, and with the support of the Red Army, represents a far more serious political factor than scores of superficial wiseacres who refuse to think through the internal logic, dialectics, of events. Again, that was an excerpt from the piece From a Scratch to the Danger of Gangrene by Leon Trotsky, 24th of January, 1940. I have that whole article on the channel. Thanks for listening. Although I'm saying thanks for listening, I still have other things to read, but I'm taking a break. So, too bad you won't get to share my break with me. You just immediately hear me start talking again. The next piece is labeled 1940, The Menshevik Split Over the USSR. This is by John G. Wright. And
it says that this is from Socialist Appeal, 6th of April 1940, the issue for the Socialist Workers' Party Convention, 5th to 9th of April 1940. The Mensheviks opposed the 1917 Workers' Revolution, believing that Russia was developed enough only for a bourgeois revolution. They had a sizable exile organization and good contacts inside the USSR. In 1940, a group around Theodor Dan split away in a pro-Stalinist direction. Trotsky had taken Dan's reports in the Menshevik press as evidence about what had happened in eastern Poland. The, quote, foreign delegation, end quote, of the Russian Mensheviks, that is, their leading center, has split on the question of the attitude towards Stalin's regime. Theodor Dan has resigned as chairman and left his post as one of the two editors of the Socialistический Vestnik, Socialist Courier, the Menshevik organ published in Paris. Yugov had resigned as secretary. Has resigned as secretary. Abramovich is now provisional chairman and sole editor. B. Divinov, the new secretary. Abramovich and his friends are, quote, principled defeatists, end quote, in relation to Stalin and the Soviet Union. Abramovich and his friends refuse to draw any distinction whatever between their, quote, defeatist policy toward Hitler and their policy toward Stalin. Dan, on the other hand, seeks to establish, quote, subtle distinctions between his attitude toward Hitler as, quote, against Stalin and the Soviet Union, end quote. Dan and Abramovich, who remained defensive under the Tsar and under Kerensky, have finally become, quote, defeatists, end quote. Abramovich wants to go the whole hog. Dan apparently has reservations. As we shall presently see, Dan's reservations do not at all flow from any deep desire on his part to defend the remaining conquests of the October Revolution, but rather from his hopes that a possibility still remains of bringing the Soviet Union back into the orbit of the democratic imperialists. Abramovich thinks the only way to attain this is by, quote, unconditional defeatism, end quote. Dan believes the more realistic policy to be that of, quote, conditional defeatism, end quote. Formally speaking, in recent years, the Mensheviks have recognized in Russia, quote, elements of socialism, end quote. Insofar as Stalin marched shoulder to shoulder with, quote, democracy, they were, quote, defensists. In other words, they were, quote, defensists yesterday for the self-same reason that they are, quote, defeatists today. When Stalin signed his pact with Hitler on the 30th of August 1939, Dan and Abramovich concluded it was necessary to reevaluate their attitude towards Stalin, whom they have always identified with the Soviet Union. There was no disputes among them as to what was involved in this reevaluation. As Abramovich writes, there was complete harmony in appraising Stalin's rule as the, quote, rule of nationalist imperialist clique, which has completely broken with the proletariat and with socialism and has degraded itself to the level of Hitlerite Nazism, end quote. Quote, all of us, end quote, explains Abramovich, quote, have unanimously recognized that Stalin's regime, has completely broken with revolution and socialism, that his regime is the greatest enemy of the working class and has become transformed into the rule of a national imperialist Bonapartist clique on the same plane as Hitler, with its fate tied irrevocably to Hitlerism, end quote. Unanimity was preserved when the Second World War actually broke out. Dan and Abramovich lined up solidly on the side of the, quote, democracies, end quote, where they still remain despite their differences. And the invasion of Finland found both of them unconditionally supporters of Mannerheim's, quote, democracy and, quote, independence. Abramovich reminds Dan that Dan himself, quote, wants with all his heart a debacle and a defeat for Stalin in his brutal assault on Finland, end quote. Why then have these good friends split? After all these years, they have a principal difference. At least Dan claims it is. Abramovich, on the contrary, brands as artificial Dan's, quote, attempt to construct some sort of difference between, quote, principled defeatism, end quote, which he, Dan, advocates towards Hitler, and some other kind of defeatism, apparently, quote, tactical defeatism, in relation not only to the Soviet Union as a country, but even towards the Stalinist regime, which oppresses the country, end quote. The ironic exclamation is Abramovich's. Abramovich, it appears, holds that there is only one kind of defeatism. Dan argues there are many Dan argues there are various kinds. Abramovich is ready to concede to Dan that there is a, quote, difference between Germany and the Soviet Union as such, i.e. as countries, but that this difference has no bearing on the question of defeatism. Abramovich's argument, in summary's form, is as follows. 1. If war is the continuation of politics by other means, then, quote, totalitarian war is the continuation of totalitarian politics, end quote. 2. A preliminary condition for the violent overthrow of a totalitarian regime is military defeat. Therefore, 3. We must strive for the most complete and ruthless military defeat of the Stalinist regime, end quote. Quote, from this it does not, of course, follow at all, end quote, continues Abramovich, quote, that we want the atomization, dismemberment, bankruptcy, or enslavement of our country or any of its various sections. On the contrary, we will fight might and main against this, end quote. Lest some innocent reader faint with surprise at Abramovich's conversion to violence, and lest he conclude that therein lies the crux of the differences between Abramovich and Don, we hasten to add that Don, too, supports the thesis of, quote, violent overthrow, end quote. Totalitarian regimes cannot be overthrown in peacetime or peacefully, they both agree. Furthermore, this, quote, revolution, end quote, so ardently supported now by Mensheviks is a, quote, palace revolution, end quote, or as Abramovich so aptly puts it, quote, of all the forms of violent overthrow of totalitarian dictatorship, the most probable appears to be that which bears in our literature the highly qualified label of a, quote, palace revolution, end quote, end quote. And Abramovich swears that Dan himself acknowledges that, quote, history, sad to say, has apparently left no other way out save for a palace revolution, end quote. A Menshevik sheds tears even when confronted by, quote, history, end quote, with such a revolution. Dan, however, is a pessimist. He warns against any illusions. It would only mean that, quote, another Bolshevik clique will come to power, end quote. That is why a different, quote, defeatist, end quote, approach is necessary. He does not want to wait for a military defeat, but seeks rather to liquidate Stalin's regime, quote, by means of inner forces, end quote, and make the, quote, revolution, end quote, a lever for the defeat of Stalin's, quote, criminal war policies, end quote. Despite his tears, Abramovich is very optimistic. Abramovich lists various, quote, palace candidates, end quote, to replace Stalin, and concludes that all of them, including Voroshilov, would be compelled to be very, very progressive. Why? Because a palace revolution, even with Voroshilov at the head, he argues, must unavoidably catapult Russia from the present coalition with Hitler into an alliance with the Allies. And what could be more, quote, progressive, end quote, than this to a Menshevik? Dan does not contest the, quote, progressive, end quote, character of such a change. He simply refuses to cherish any illusions that a Voroshilov will behave better than a Stalin. After all, they are both, quote, Bolsheviks, end quote, in Dan's eyes. P. Garvey, a, quote, principled defeatist, end quote, argues as follows against Dan's position. Quote, what we need is clarity. The instrument of the Marxist method must serve us, but so as not vainly to obscure controversial issues, so as not to cover up semi-assertions immediately accompanied by qualifications, so as not to linger and temporize, which only paralyzes action, ... Our times demand forthright answers to the accursed questions. It is impermissible under the cloak of, quote, dialectics, end quote, to cover up lapses and irreconcilable contradictions in one's own position, ... It is impermissible to see in Soviet Russia a totalitarian state, ... and at the same time to seek in this social order of state slavery, quote, elements of socialism, end quote, which must be, quote, sustained, end quote, until the world's social revolution. It is impermissible to want to want the defeat of the Soviet Union in the war against Finland, and at the same time, with glaring inconsistency, to insist on a subtle distinction between the two aggressors, ... advocating towards one of them, the Third Reich, principled defeatism, and toward the other, the Soviet Union, a restricted, temporary, and conditional defeatism, end quote. What style? What thought? That's the end of the piece. Socialist Appeal, 6th of April 1940, the issue for the Socialist Workers' Party Convention of the 5th to 9th of April 1940. The next piece is labeled Mensheviks Hail Stalin's, quote, war revolution, end quote. This is by Louis Jacobs. and it's from 1943. This is originally from a piece titled "A Russian Menshevik Turns to Stalin." It was published under the name of A. Roland in The Militant on the 22nd of May, 1943. It is the strange fate of some would-be leaders of the masses to take the wrong road at every turn in history. The October Revolution was the greatest event in all history. Despite its degeneration under the dictatorship of Stalin, it has left its stamp on an entire epoch. At its inspired height under the leadership of Lenin and Trotsky, the October Revolution could attract and kindle into revolutionary flame workers from all lands, but not the Russian Mensheviks. The Abramoviches and the Dans preferred capitalist exile to the living revolution. The Abramoviches and Dans were wrong again on the bitter struggle between revolutionary Marxism under the banner of Trotsky and revisionary, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, under the GPU aegis of Stalin. The Mensheviks interpret it entirely in the sense of an internal personal struggle for power. Nevertheless, many Mensheviks found it to their liking to move in the direction of Stalinism. Many, like Vyshinsky, became his henchmen, aiding him to exterminate ruthlessly the old Bolsheviks who might yet serve to lead the proletarian revolution at its next stage. One might suppose that the crimes of Stalin in carrying through the bloody purges, Stalin's reactionary policies that strengthened a privileged caste in the Soviet Union at the expense of the masses of workers and peasants, his foreign diplomacy that weakened the international proletariat and made capitalism stronger, all this would hardly be likely to attract anybody to Stalinism at this late date. The Menshevik leader Theodor Dan teaches us differently. Dan refuses from the beginning to not only supported the Allies in the war, but agitated that the Soviet Union must enter the war on the side of the, quote, democracies. Dan and his supporters called the Second World War not just a war, but a war revolution. Correctly enough, in one respect, Dan says that the Soviet Union can play a decisive role in aiding the socialist revolution in Europe. But what about the Stalinist leadership? Ah, yes, says Dan, the leaders of the Soviet Union must reform and find a new road. Let us quote the words that, if given credence and support by the workers, could lead to nothing but new defeats. Quote, the moral political capital accumulated for 25 years of the Russian Revolution is so great that up to now it was more than sufficient to cover all the defects inherited from the past, but which have long outlived themselves. In the chaos of the military, diplomatic, and revolutionary storms which the Soviet Union is facing, it will be ever more difficult to live on the old capital. The coming storms are already making gigantic demands on it that the creation of new revolutionary and socialist values become for it a law of self-preservation. All the elements for creating them exist in Soviet reality, because all those survivals of the past which threatened to press with such a heavy burden on the Soviet Union were not engendered by any creative impotence of the Russian Revolution, but merely by the difficulties of its development under the conditions of extreme backwardness and isolation which themselves are receding into the past. Quote, this suffices to make it easier for the leaders of the Soviet state themselves to begin liquidation of all that which has lost all rights to exist, and for the issuance to new roads where all the detachments of the working class can meet for a united struggle for peace, freedom, and socialism. At any rate, this suffices for us Russian socialists, so that with an unshakable faith in final victory, we should also invest all our forces and work in order that in the epoch of the coming storms, the Soviet Union should find the Soviet Union self at the height of those gigantic tasks which history places upon the Soviet Union as upon the powerful support of the toilers of the whole world in their struggle to the death against fascism and for socialist democracy, end quote. Dan does not enumerate those, quote, defects, end quote, that marred the Stalinist leadership of the Soviet Union. Dan's opinion, it seems, is that Stalin in the past 25 years, quote, accumulated, end quote, moral political capital instead of completely dissipating it. The tasks of the future are so great that this Menshevik is ready to overlook the peccadilloes of Stalin's conduct of the past. Here we see the danger to those workers who may be misled by Don's complete failure to analyze the real meaning of Stalinism. Don leaves out the key fact that Stalin was able to gain control of the Soviet Union only in a period of decline and reaction, and that he is wholly incapable of giving leadership in a period of advance, above all in the period that will mark the new rise of the revolutionary wave. Dan has managed after a whole decade to grasp a few ideas of the Trotskyist movement. Give Dan credit for desiring to defend the Soviet Union against any attack by capitalism, whether of the Axis or the Allied variety. What Dan still has not learned is one elementary lesson, that Stalinism and the Soviet Union are not only not identical, they are antithetical. Just 10 years ago, the Trotskyists created the Fourth International precisely because there remained not the faintest hope that the Soviet bureaucracy could be reformed. The history of those 10 years of Hitler's power in Germany has confirmed at every turn the conclusion then reached by the Trotskyist movement. Far from pinning any hope in a reform of the Stalinist bureaucracy, and in the possibility that the gravediggers of the October Revolution can become the leaders of the workers in the renewal of October, every worker must learn that Stalinism stands within the working class as the greatest obstacle to achieving socialism. Dan shares the superficial opinion of the capitalists and their spokesmen, like Davies, Joseph E. Davies, former U.S. ambassador to Moscow, that Stalin will emerge from the war with enhanced prestige. We do not share that opinion. The masses of Russia have excited the admiration of the entire world by their grim and steadfast defense of the first worker state, but they have fought courageously in spite of and not because of the Soviet bureaucracy. The fear of war always stood in the way of the opening of a struggle by the masses against the Kremlin bureaucracy. That fear is now gone, or will be gone, with the emergence of a victorious Soviet Union. The end. Again, this was originally titled "A Russian Menshevik Turns to Stalin," written by Louis Jacobs under the pen name of A. Roland, the Militant, May 22nd, 1943. It's actually the end of chapter 4, so thank you for listening.